Welcome back to the Photaudiography podcast. I'm your host Luke, and today I'll be talking about the question of whether you should shoot RAW or JPEG. So first, I want to answer the question of what is RAW and JPEG, and what these are is they're file formats that are used to show a computer or a camera how the data is stored within a file. So often your computer will assign a certain program to open certain file extensions or file formats. For example, an MP3 file could be opened in iTunes, or if you have another audio playing program like on your computer or a tablet, it will open those type of files. So that's what we mean by RAW and JPEG. It's just basically the file extension or file format of the image. So I want to start off by saying that one is not better than the other, and anyone that tells you that, you should be very leery of that. They both have positives and negatives. I want to try to explain both the positive and negatives for each to sort of let you decide what is better for you in your photography. And each have their own uses, so it's really up to the photographer and how you want to approach your photography and what works better for you. So not every camera offers a RAW format, and just because your camera doesn't offer a RAW format doesn't mean you can't get good photos from that camera. And a lot of lower end cameras won't have a RAW option, but it's becoming more popular in a lot of different cameras, and even like some smartphones and things, to have a RAW option. And just full disclosure, I mostly shoot RAW because I usually do editing with my photos after I shoot them on the computer, and sometimes I don't always nail the exposure, and with RAW images they're much more forgiving, and overall RAW gives you more flexibility. But let me back up here and explain in more detail the technical differences between RAW and JPEG. RAW files are files that contain data for an image that is not processed very much by the camera, but it must be processed afterwards to create an image file. And this type of file could be thought of as a digital negative. Someone once explained it to me is it's not actually an image, it's more of just data. Whereas a JPEG file is a processed image that is compressed and processed by your camera that's easily transferable, and this type of image can be thought as a digital positive. So RAW images take all the data from the image sensor from your camera and put it into a file, whereas the JPEG images are compressed and processed to create a finished product. I'll give you sort of a metaphor here where you can think of these file formats in terms of a meal. So a RAW image would be equivalent to buying all the ingredients needed to create a meal. You would need to prepare the ingredients, you would need to cook the ingredients, add seasonings, prepare them how you would like them to create the meal. On the other hand, a JPEG image would be the equivalent of getting a meal served to you like at a restaurant. All the ingredients have been prepared and cooked and are all ready to eat, and there's not much change you can do to it. Like if you like cooking your favorite dish one way, the JPEG option or the restaurant option doesn't give you a whole lot of option for changing it. If you're cooking your own meal, you can make it however you want. So which is better? And as I said before, it's more what is better for you. I usually shoot RAW because it gives you more flexibility, and the RAW format collects more data from the sensor and doesn't compress the data, so you're able to manipulate the image without losing as much image quality. Now when you use a JPEG format, the image is already baked or compressed, and if you do any kind of heavy editing, it'll really distort the image. An example I always like to use is if you underexpose an image in RAW format and try to correct the exposure, you're going to get a lot better results and won't lose much image quality. But on the other hand, if you have a JPEG image and you try to, a JPEG image that's underexposed, and you try to adjust the exposure, you can do it a little bit, but it's not going to be as forgiving as the raw image. Let me outline some quick advantages and disadvantages for each format. So some advantages of RAW is that you get more colors, a larger dynamic range, far more editing potential, and it's a lossless or uncompressed file. Now, some disadvantages of the RAW files are that they require post-processing, like on your computer, and they're larger image files, and RAW files are not standard across devices like tablets and things, so they may not work with all devices. Now, on the other hand, advantages of JPEGs are that they're already processed and ready to share. They're compatible with phones, tablets, all kinds of devices, and the file sizes are smaller than RAW. Now, the disadvantages of JPEG is the color format is limited to 8 bits. So the dynamic range is not as much, and recovery of highlights and shadows is far less because there's less data available. And the camera settings, some cameras have like effect settings that can be set like black and white, or like creative settings that make your pictures look like cartoons and things. And with JPEG, these settings are usually not reversible. If you shoot in RAW, you can usually change these settings later on the computer if you want. It usually on your camera will just show you like a preview of like the changed image. So just to give you a broader overview, the RAW images are collecting a lot of data, and that data can give you more flexibility and more creativity with your images. JPEGs, they're sort of what you see is what you get. You know, you can make some adjustments to it, but for the most part, you're going to get a lot of distortion if you try to do a lot of changes. Here's another thing to keep in mind is that RAW files can always be converted into JPEG images fairly easily with software. You know, some cameras have it even on the camera to convert to JPEG, but JPEG images cannot be converted into a RAW. Like, you can't get that data back. I like to always say that whenever people are asking me what they think they should shoot in. For a lot of people, JPEG will work great, but if you're really wanting to get all that detail, try shooting in RAW. A lot of cameras have an option where you can shoot RAW and JPEG, and it'll save them both to the memory card in the camera. And I certainly encourage you to take photos using both RAW and JPEG, do some editing, and see for yourself what results you get, because I know I've done testing over the years and it kind of boggled my mind, because for a while I shot RAW because I was like, oh yeah, I want to get all that, and then for a while I was like, I don't want to bother with shooting RAW. It's so much extra work and takes up so much space. But then I took an image that was really dark and I cranked up the exposure in Lightroom, and I was just amazed at how much I could do to the RAW image versus the JPEG image. Now this, you know, I was just doing testing. It wasn't like this was a situation where I needed the image, but I was just amazed at how much detail was still there in the RAW image versus the JPEG image. Whenever I tried to bring the exposure back on it, it just got distorted and looked terrible. Now, I encourage you to do some experimenting on your own, like I said, but you may notice that your JPEG images look so much better right out of your camera than the RAW images. If you bring them up in something like Lightroom, you might look at them and say, well, the JPEG images look a lot better. And that could be because of the settings that are set on your camera, like noise reduction or, you know, sharpening, things that are set on your camera that are happening automatically to the JPEG images that in the RAW images are not transferring when you transfer them to the computer. So that's something to keep in mind, is that if you're looking at them side by side and you immediately say, well, the RAW image just looks really flat, or doesn't look as good as the JPEG, keep in mind what settings you have on your camera, such as additional contrast or sharpening, that may attribute to your JPEGs looking different than your RAW. Because like I said earlier, these settings on your camera, the photo may look different than once you import it into the computer, just because the screen is showing a sharpened or higher contrast image because of the settings that you set. I'll just give you a few examples here of when I think it's more important to use the RAW image format versus the JPEG. So if you're doing a lot of like landscape or high dynamic range photography that's in difficult or like dark lighting situations, or larger format printing, those are times when I would highly recommend using a RAW image. And especially look in the settings in your camera. There's different bit depths and compressions for both the JPEG and the RAW versions that can change like the file size and how much data is collected. And definitely the JPEG is good if you need to share the images right away, or you're in a situation where you're not going to be doing a lot of editing. Also, as I briefly mentioned earlier, I like to use RAW because I don't always nail the exposure, and I think RAW is so much more forgiving. It takes a lot more time, and if you're a beginner photographer, RAW might be intimidating, but I think you really get into a workflow with it if you have some great programs like Adobe Lightroom. I think is great, and there's lots of other programs, but I mean that's a very popular one, and I can talk about that in a future episode of the podcast. But just getting that workflow down with the RAW, I think, is very helpful if you would like to use RAW but you might be a little bit intimidated by it. And also, as I mentioned earlier, you can always convert RAW images to JPEG, delete the RAW images and just keep the JPEGs if you want. But if you shoot a JPEG, then you're stuck with that sort of baked image. So just keep that in mind. But like I say, I don't have any stake in either. I personally shoot RAW when I can, just because that's what I like to use, but I've used both, and both will give you great results. But I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of what the differences are, what the advantages and disadvantages are, and just sort of help you make your own decision about which would be the best for your photography. Alright, well, I think that's enough bad advice for now. I'll see you later, Shutterbugs.